Hey, it's Karyn Bryant for MMA Heat. I'm here with my good friend Steven Marrocco, and we are here to do a UFC 158 wrap-up. And Steven, first and foremost, we should remind people always where they can read your content.
MMAJunkie.com, and if you are still in the business of reading words on a printed page, you can go and check out Fight Magazine.
Oh, very nice, very nice. Well, let's get right to it. There was obviously some interesting things that happened on the pay-per-view edition, but I do want to talk to you about the preliminary card and see if there was anything that stood out to you on the FX edition.
Well, I think what we were talking about before was the stoppage in the Darren Elkins, Antonio Carvalho. Yeah, there was a little bit of controversy about that, and I think that's I'm not one of the people who would say that it was stopped too early. I think it was maybe a tad bit early, but it's not one of those stoppages that I would actually, get out the internet pitchfork for, because I would rather it be a little bit early than a little bit late. And the way that that bout was going, him getting dropped solid, and the way that he looked after he caught the really heavy punch, he was going nowhere but down. So,
but I do think it was early. I think that you're right in that he was definitely wobbled earlier, and that it may have been something that was going to happen later anyway. But I think when a guy is standing there defending a punch and still good to go, and I feel like, for a minute maybe Eve was like, oh, that might have been a little early. But, once you commit, you got to commit. I do think it was a little early. I don't know if those two will get an immediate rematch or what. I don't know if that really is what they would do in that situation. But I actually did think it was a little early.
yeah, the thing is that being a ref is not an easy job, and when it comes to situations like that, these things are playing over split seconds. I took Big John's refereeing course a while ago, and I failed. And it was precisely because of the reason that those split-second calls are things where experience comes into play. Not saying Yves Levine is the perfect referee. We all saw the Matt Brown, Pete Self fight, I think it was. Abominable stoppage. That was far too late, and perhaps Eves is just erring on the side of caution now. That's a very human thing to do. Does he get it wrong all the time? Does he get it right all the time? Absolutely not. But he also got it right with the Nate Marquardt stoppage. I think he was the referee on that one, and he's had some. And I think he was on for T.J. Dillashaw as well, so he got it right on that call as well.
Nice. All right. Well, what else stood out to you? Were you interested in the Cote debut at 170?
Yeah, I thought that the decision, I didn't agree with the decision. I thought that Bobby Volker won. I thought he did enough.
It was a split decision win, we should remind people, for Cote.
Yeah, it was, actually, no, wait.
Was it unanimous? No, you're right.
Yeah, it actually says unanimous, 29-28. Yeah, no, but it felt like one of those, when I was watching with my friend, we thought it was going to be a split call in favor of Patrick Cote, primarily because he's a hometown guy and he's a favorite. I still think Bobby did enough to win that fight. I think he did more damage to Cote, and he obviously dominated in the third round when Cote was running on fumes. And that's a big issue going forward with Cote, whether he can actually, he has the, he seems like he's still adjusting to the weight class. I mean, this is his first time, so he obviously faded in the later rounds, and that's something he's going to have to look at when he goes back to 170. But other than that, I thought Jordan Mean was the big standout of the FX televised preliminary card, because he's a guy that has been sort of like the best kept secret in Canada for many years. A lot of people were very, very excited about him, and he obviously lost to Tyron Woodley because Tyron's such a great wrestler. But the kid on his feet, and in general, he's 22. He's like 22 or 23 years old, and he's just getting better and better and better and more dangerous. And he's one of the guys. He's like Gunnar Nelson. That could make some big noise in the welterweight division moving forward.
Yeah. Well, and it also does speak to the fact that over the last few fights that we've seen, the Strikeforce fighters have done very well, even in defeat. I think somebody like Bobby Volker, some of these guys are still putting on good performances, and just what last time we saw Robbie Lawler, who granted we used to be in the UFC, but come back from the Strikeforce and just whoop Koscheck. So I think all those Strikeforce guys, you're right, they are actually negating the argument that they haven't been tough and they haven't been fighting real fighters.
Absolutely.
All right, well, so let's move on to the pay-per-view card. It started off with Colin Fletcher and Mike Ricci. We all know that Mike Ricci is a training partner of Rory McDonald. We had Faraz Zahabi in the corner there. Colin Fletcher was the runner-up of Tough's matches. Mike Ricci was the runner-up of Tough with Carwin and Lesnar, I believe it was, right? So he lost to Colton Smith. So what did you take away from this fight? It was the first one of the night, and I can't say it really started the night off with a bang.
Yeah, I don't think the first two fights. We'll get to the fight after that at Camozzi ring, but yeah, the first two fights of the pay-per-view card just weren't that good. And Ricci was fighting for the first time at what he would consider to be his natural weight class, which is lightweight, as opposed to being on the show and being outsized by a guy like Colton Smith. Right. Ricci is a guy that I think is very talented, and I'm getting the gut feeling that he might be one of those guys that's awesome in the gym and struggles under the spotlight.
Okay.
Because he's got the greatest training partners, he's got the greatest training camp. He knows he has all the skills, but I question whether he has the ability to put it all together when the chips are down, basically. Because Colin Fletcher, I think he had a huge advantage on the ground when he got the fight to the ground late in the fight. Yeah. It was very clear that he was on a different level, but I don't know whether he just wanted to stand at him, just to prove a point. But I think he probably could have put away Colin a lot sooner.
Yeah, and I don't know. It's interesting because I was in Australia for the Smashes finale, and Colin
was I.
Yes, right. Colin lost that fight, and I remember afterwards, Norman Park said, when Colin could tell he was losing near the end, he's like, let's just go for it. Let's just scrap. Let's just get into war. Let's just bang. And the whole time Norman's like, but I'm beating you. Why would I risk that? Colin is not a methodical fighter. So I don't know if that's something that he needs to learn and learn how to get people in the positions where he can take advantage better. I don't know. I feel like, the last couple times he has a lot of ability. He just hasn't been able to perform and put his game plan forward.
This is Colin we're talking about, Freak Show?
Yeah,
I think that's true to a certain extent. I mean, I think Colin's got great kicks. He's a great, straight up European kickboxer kind of fighter. I'm not sure what he has on the ground. We haven't really seen a whole lot of him on the ground yet. I just think that maybe he's a guy that he's obviously got a marketing angle. Sure. He does the Freak Show thing, and he gets a lot of attention for himself. But I think he needs a lot more seasoning. Sure. I think he needs to go to a preliminary card and build himself up. They need to give him some lower tier opponents to really build his skills and to get him moving forward. Because from what I've seen so far, I mean, he's good in a certain couple of areas, but he's got a lot of work to go.
Sure. Well, let's move on to Chris Camozzi and Nick Ring. This was the second fight of the night, and again, not the most oh my God fight. That was still to come. What would you take away?
I don't know. They asked me to write about the fight as in a preview, and they're both guys they're certainly tough. They've got good skills, but nothing really stands out that crazy about them. And the fight was kind of the same way. It was just a very kind of a blah fight. I think Nick Ring probably should have and he probably would have gotten knocked out by if Chris was having a better night in the stand-up, because he's coming in there with his hands to his sides and just asking to get tagged. And I think a better performance from Chris probably would have had him on the floor. The guy's got a great chin and he can take a shot, but it just seemed like they kind of canceled each other out. They just didn't, sometimes you put those fights together, they look good on paper, but the guys don't make music when you put them in the cage together. So it's just one of those fights I think we'd all rather move on from.
Yeah, there were moments, there were glimmers of exchanges and things that for a minute were kind of like, oh, tagged you back type thing. But I agree, not that much excitement. At one point, Nick Ring was a person who had gone 12-0 before his first loss. He's now dropped 2 of his last 3, and Chris Camozzi is on a 4-fight winning streak. But again, Nick Ring won, what some might say was a gimme in Calgary against why am I blanking on his name? Beard, tough. Okay, this is crazy. What?
Court McGee.
What's up? Court McGee, right?
Court
I really enjoy Court McGee. Who, got a win in the other day, so that was good for him. But, I think a lot of people thought Nick Ring got the gimme in that decision because he was the local fighter. And so turnabout might be fair play in this situation that it didn't go his way up in Canada. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think he got that with Fukuda as well. If I'm not mistaken, that was a really close fight as well that people were like, I think he got kind of a gift there. But as you said, karma.
Yes. Well, moving right along to the, oh, snap. This is where we start to get a little bit of excitement is Jake Ellenberger versus Nate Marquardt. Nate, of course, was former Strikeforce champ. Then he lost that when Tarek Safadine just went to town on him. Jake Ellenberger is somebody who was on the rise and had a little stumble, coming back strong. Jake is somebody who, I've really gotten to know him over the last couple of years, and I think he's not only a terrific fighter, but just a really solid stand-up guy. Really went out there to prove a point. Got knockout of the night against Nate Marquardt. I thought he just looked terrific.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Jake has been somebody I've talked to over the years, and actually is a really supportive guy. He's a big fan of MMA, and he's a really good guy to talk to. Mm-hmm. That being said, I didn't pick him last night.
Oh,
yeah, I was actually one of the lone dissenters, and I'll tell you why. Is because Nate is so talented. He's such a talented fighter. And he's got crazy finishing instincts. When he gets somebody hurt, he really jumps on and really finishes guys. But it's an issue of which Nate Marquardt shows up at this point, because there's a Nate Marquardt that's aggressive and creative and inventive when he strikes, and then there's a Nate Marquardt that's very, very passive and tentative and backs up and lets other guys initiate. So the whole scenario that I laid out didn't even happen. Basically what happened was Jake hit him with those lunch boxes, and Nate went, oh, snap.
Right.
And after that, he was a different fighter. That set up the finish for, Jake to come in and land that huge punch a little bit later in the fight. So Jake really impressed me because he's just got that power to change a fight on a dime. When he's got that power and when you combine that with his wrestling ability, the issue with him is getting, as he admits, is getting too carried away and opening himself up for like a counter when he goes after the finish.
Goes in for the kill. Well, he did have, Nate threw a couple of kicks and had Jake, sort of scrambling for a minute there to regain his composure. But Jake, like you said, went in for the kill, and it was interesting. I guess after the fight, Dana praised Jake for not going for a takedown, going for the kill, going for the, because look, Jake trains with Mark Munoz. The guy has a good wrestling background. He's a very strong guy. Obviously could have, worked takedowns. I'd say, obviously, I'm not saying Nate is easy to take down, but I know that Jake has that in his arsenal, and didn't even use that, just went for the punches. So, initially he was supposed to fight Johny Hendricks. That's an interesting matchup. I think that fight, would have been a tougher fight for Jake.
Yes.
But I think he's doing a really good job, and I think he's good about not crying for the next fight and I gotta get my title. He's patient, he's respectful of the big picture, and I think just more great things are in store for him. So.
The question is, what does he do now? Because you've got Hendricks with a hand injury, waiting for a GSP.
Yeah.
Don't know when GSP wants to fight next.
Right.
So he's right at the top of the division. A lot of people were saying Damian Maia. If you're Jake, do you fight Damian Maia or do you wait for the winner of Hendricks St-Pierre, even if that's even on the table?
I don't know. Damian Maia would be dangerous.
That would be a tough fight.
Because jiu-jitsu is Jake's weak link. So that's Damian's, Damian owns that market, so that would be interesting. We shall see, but let's move on to Johny Hendricks and Carlos Condit. This fight was just fantastic. We all know Johny Hendricks came away with the victory, and it was funny before this fight. I kept saying, okay, so is Carlos getting KO'd, or is Johny just going to eat so many knees, that he'll just get blasted and can't take it? And a little bit of both of those things happened. I thought that was a tremendous fight, and I think Johny those takedowns over and over. There was one takedown at one point where you could see Carlos's face. He was like, "Are you kidding me?" He's like, again. He was just so frustrated by that.
Yeah, it was a great fight. Obviously, wrestling proved to be the difference.
Yeah.
But there's an important thing to consider, and this is actually something I thought about after the fight, and that is that if you are wrestling somebody, if you're taking somebody to the ground and you're not doing damage, then it's merely a change of position. And I didn't, that wasn't really internalized for me until I took an actual class on judging and learned to see, you know, like learned what to look for basically. Because Hendricks was taking him down, but he wasn't doing anything with the takedowns. So a lot of people were saying, well, Carlos won the fight because he was, you know, the guy that was working from the bottom, doing elbows and throwing up submission attempts and stuff like that. So I think that Hendricks did enough in the first 2 rounds to take the fight. It might have been closer than the scorecards indicated.
Yeah.
And obviously that 3rd round, Johnny was just kind of in survival mode.
Yeah.
But I think Hendricks did just enough to take home the decision, and I don't have a problem with him being the victor. Now it's a question of how long he's going to be out for with that hand.
With the hand, and I mean we're kind of combined because we know what happened obviously in the main event. Do you think Johnny can beat George? Because if you're having a conversation about takedowns and damage on the ground, George doesn't do a lot of damage there either. So what happens when those two fight each other?
We haven't seen Johnny on his back yet, or at least I haven't. From my memory, your viewers can correct me if I'm wrong, and they probably will.
They definitely will.
They definitely will. But from my memory, we just haven't seen a whole lot of Johnny on his back, so we don't know how he performs from that position. I would say that wrestlers who get into MMA are typically better at scrambling and initiating scrambles than jiu-jitsu-based fighters that get into MMA. So that's a positive. But I think the real takeaway from this fight is Johnny's gas tank. Yeah. Because it seemed to me like he was really fading in later rounds. And the thing is that I was, again, talking with my friend, when every punch that you throw is to maim and hurt, it gets you tired much faster. Sure. And if Johnny can't put away George in the first part of the fight, how is he going to perform if this fight goes into round 4 and round 5 with GSP? It's a pretty safe bet that it's going to do so. Sure. So that's the real takeaway for me in terms of looking at that fight down the road.
And on the flip side of that, do you know, I thought Carlos looked, you know, I think Carlos is a very good fighter. Let's just put that out there. And I think, you know, against a lot of other people, he would have just crushed him. You know, if you took away the takedowns, you know what I mean, then, yeah, it is a different fight. Do you think that a Carlos Condit Nick Diaz rematch is a good idea?
You know, I was thinking about that, and I think you're going to have a lot easier time getting Nick to take that fight than you are Carlos. That is, assuming that Nick is not, you know, retiring.
Well, right, because he was retired in the cage, and then after at the press conference, he was talking about fighting Anderson Silva. So, and he wants a rematch with George, right, because he says he knows he can beat George. You know, on the one hand, he's through, which he's told me before. I saw him when we were in Seattle for Nate's fight with Bendo, and Nick and I had a talk for a while, and he was saying that, yeah, he's been through, and all this stuff has happened. You know, he's emotional, and he needs better guidance. That's a whole other story. But I do think a rematch with Carlos would be kind of great.
No, and it would be very marketable.
Yeah.
It was very controversial when it happened, and it's a fight. But again, I think that's a fight that you might have an easier time convincing Nick to do than Carlos. Agreed. Because Carlos obviously feels that he won it clearly. It was not controversial to him. He has a lot to lose by fighting and losing to Nick Diaz, although I don't think he would, but it would be a tough fight.
So then who else would you put Carlos? You know, if we're talking about the whole fact that this welterweight thing was a shakeup, so then just Carlos fight Marquardt and loser leaves the UFC? I mean, what happens?
That's a possibility. That's actually I like that fight. That's I think Nate would probably take him down, probably try and take him down.
Yeah,
and
Nate's
wrestle
a stronger
wrestler. Yeah, or maybe you know, boy, I don't know. Maybe put him against Robbie. I mean, they usually do winners against winners.
Right.
Looking through the division here.
Well, Koscheck.
I don't. Yeah, or Koscheck, but Koscheck is coming off of loss too, so you could do that. But we could figure how that would go if Koscheck is coming off back-to-back losses. Right. You'd probably try and wrestle him.
Right.
Not sure. Great question. Yes. Bookmarked for later.
Bookmarked for later. Well, moving on then, let's talk about Nick Diaz and George St-Pierre. I was with a friend watching it. We didn't get to go to the fights because Wade, the other half of MMA Heat here, was out celebrating his grandfather's 90th birthday. So happy birthday, Papa. Was every now and then, Steven, real life comes into play, and we have to miss a fight. But I was watching with a friend, and she was rooting for George, and she just kept saying, George, finish him. And I just kept looking at her going, it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah, probably, yeah. We know.
I was like, yeah, it's probably not going to happen. Yeah, obviously, clearly he dominated the fight. Clearly his strength is a huge factor. Nick doesn't have that kind of strength. They're built totally differently. Although I do, George started looking at the clock sort of early in the third round. Very aware of the time, very aware of like, oh boy, because Nick's not going to get worn out. And Nick with the taunting, I can't remember exactly what round everything started to happen with the hands down and the chin out. And, you can tell like Nick's trying to draw him into the fight where his fight, which is what he did with Carlos and the taunting and all of that. It was frustrating to me because you could just see that Nick didn't. I mean, as it progressed, I think his takedown defense got better, and which is why his corner, Faraz told George to stop being proactive with the takedowns and be reactive with him and stuff. But it was frustrating because I felt like Nick got punched right up the middle a lot of time for somebody who's supposed to be a great boxer. His boxing defense wasn't there. And I know he always eats it to give it, but I just kept thinking, don't eat so much. Because, we remember what Koscheck's face looked like after. We know, George can jab you to death, after a while. And so, it was an interesting fight, but it was kind of what I expected was going to happen.
Sure. Try being Nick Diaz's cornerman.
Right.
Try giving him directions. Try being the guy that has to influence that guy's, path. I mean, it seems to me he's going to do what he's going to do. Whether he got the idea himself to start sprawling in the later rounds, or if that was a directive of his corner, who knows? But to me, the big takeaway from that fight is that I think Nick's speed isn't there.
Yeah.
He was really noticeably slower. Mm-hmm. And I've been noticing that as his fighting career has progressed.
Right.
He obviously got the biggest fight of his career. He got the title shot. He got paid a lot of money from what I heard. And he can continue going on fighting, but I see it as, at this point, as diminishing returns because he is he should have tooled GSP in the stand-up.
Yeah.
He just wasn't fast enough.
Right.
GSP was way faster. Before Nick could defend, GSP had that jab up the middle. And to be fair, GSP has one of the best jabs in the business.
Sure.
So Nick just couldn't reach him with his left hand. And every time he would get forward, he would get stopped by the jab, and then GSP would angle off, and there goes that exchange.
Yeah.
Only in the third round did GSP get a little bit away from his game plan for whatever reason.
Right.
And that's when the fight got exciting for about, 2 minutes. When Nick started putting together a few combinations.
Right. Yeah, Nick got a little bit of momentum there, and then you went, oh, okay, here we go.
Here we have a fight, exactly. Yeah. But otherwise, it's the same story that it's been for Nick Diaz with most of his UFC career, that he's just not very good at stopping the takedown. He's too passive off of his back, and he's been playing the same game for years. It's very easy to figure him out if you want to. If you want to play your own game and do your own game plan, it's easy to figure out. And GSP had a lot of footage to look at to do so. So, I mean, Nick is a guy who's always going to be promotable, and you can get plenty of more marquee fights out of him. He'll always be a guy that can sell a fight. But for me, in terms of the sporting, part of me that wants to see an athlete compete at his best and not take undue brain damage, I think it might be time. It's getting close for Nick if it's not already here.
Well, and obviously he does his triathlons. He's very competitive in those. So, it's not like he won't ever have a way to express his competitive side. It's interesting in the press conference, he on the one hand, he'll come right out and say, I'm not going to make excuses, but then explains, or if you're not a Nick Diaz fan, gives excuse, you know, you would say that he gave excuses for what happened and admitted that the year layoff was tough. He admitted that he said, you know, for most of the time I sat around depressed, you know, wondering if I was going to get this fight with George. And he said, you know, I was with Nate and Dana came up to me and started talking to me about doing this fight. He said, but, you know, for a long time I was depressed about it not happening. He said, when, for this camp, he said it was really hard to get people to work because, you know, Gilbert's got his own thing coming up, so can't go as hard and, you know, or whatever, has to focus on his own thing, which is legit, you know, and Jake and this and that. Just, I believe that team is very close, but I believe that Nick needs to look elsewhere now to if he's going to keep fighting. I mean, you know, if all of us sit around, I don't know if you do, we'd sit around here if we're like, if we could play Nick's manager, you know, for 3 months, I swear I feel like I could fix stuff. And that's no disrespect to Caesar, but I just feel like, you know, if you're the big fish in the pond for a long time, you know, stuff changes. Maybe you get yesed too much. Maybe you don't get pushed enough. Maybe nobody challenges you to say get your butt here on time. And I don't know. Liking Nick Diaz as much as I do, I want to see good things happen to him and for him. And so it's hard. It's hard when you see somebody's potential not being used to full advantage and not being taken. You know, it's hard. It's really hard. It's
frustrating. I mean, you said it. I mean, it's frustrating watching a guy who's delivered so many, you know, insanely entertaining performances over the years. It's hard to watch him shoot himself in the foot so much.
Yes.
But it's not up to us to change him.
I know.
You know what I mean? He's going to be this is my opinion. He's going to be who he's going to be. I would never want to be his manager. I don't have that kind of patience.
Right.
But, you know, he's a guy that you have to remember that when he left the UFC, he left on a losing note. Mm-hmm. And it was for precisely the reason that we saw this past Saturday. Mm-hmm. When he went to Strikeforce, he got a bunch of favorable matchups that really made him look good. And I know this because I talked to Coker several times. They built him up as a star. They gave him very winnable fights, people that would fight his kind of fight. Mm-hmm. And the cool thing is that he managed to get past guys that he might have lost to, like Daly. Like, he almost got knocked out by Daly.
That was a great fight.
Right, exactly. Or BJ Penn.
Yeah.
BJ Penn's another great example. But BJ Penn was an example where BJ was on the tail end of his career. It was one of those perfect fights where where a legend is on the tail end, and a guy like Nick can come along and get to that next level by beating him. But again, we saw with Condit and we saw with St-Pierre, speed. He doesn't have the speed anymore, and he never really had the wrestling. So he's a very promotable guy that has a glass ceiling, and that's the business. You know, that's the business that we work in. And if you dialed it back 10 years, it might be different, or 5 years, or whatever. But them's the breaks.
So, what do you think about George? You know, how much longer do you think he'll fight?
You know, there's this whole secret plan thing going around where it's like 3 fights. You know, Diaz, Hendricks, and Silva. I don't know if I think that's necessarily true. And even if it was, I don't think St-Pierre would really admit to it. But I think GSP is smart. I think he'll probably fight maybe. I think the number was right. Maybe 3-4 more fights.
Yeah.
And then he gets out of it, because I'm sure that, you know, every time that guy takes damage. I mean, did you notice like how bad his face looked like after taking like a quarter of the damage that Diaz did?
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
Right. So I just think that I don't think his reasons are different. I think he loves fighting and he loves martial arts, but he doesn't love the war.
Well, right, and I don't really know what else he needs to prove. I mean, that was something that I thought was interesting in the post-fight pressers, that Nick talked about getting great fights and big fights, and, you know, he feels like he's fought the people he wanted to fight, you know, and win or lose, at least got what he wanted to do. I don't know, does George have anything to prove anymore? I mean, is he still just besting himself? I don't know what would necessarily keep him. He doesn't seem like the guy that's dying for like super fights and da-da-da. I mean, you know.
Maybe though, if he went out on the sunset, maybe that would be the thing.
Yeah.
Maybe he would go out with that fight. He'd certainly make an ass load of money fighting Silva in Dallas. You know what I mean?
Right.
So maybe that's a fight that he goes out on. Although, who wants to go out? You know, I don't know. Then
you were going to say who wants to go out on a loss?
I don't know. I think he'll end up concussed, but that's just me.
Well, anyway, Steven, it was interesting. We will see what happens with the welterweights shaking out. Looking forward to up next. We've got Gustafsson and Mousasi. I like that.
Yeah, those are your boys. You like Alex, and that's another one that you're going to have a tough time for. I'm not going to want to be next to you because there's going to be a lot of forearm grabbing.
There is. I like both those guys, and you know, people know I'm a Gegard fan. I've been for a long time, and you know, Alexander. There's nothing not to like about the guy, and he's on the rise, and it'll be an interesting fight. A lot of people don't know about Gegard, and so I have a and you know, he's admitted. In the past, he didn't train that hard. His last fight, he did train harder. So I feel like we've got a renewed Mousasi, and he's coming in, the UFC to fight Alexander in a place where Alexander is supposed to win because they're fighting in Sweden. So I think that's going to be a fun show.
Absolutely, looking forward to it. It's interesting that they put Gegard. If Gegard's the prospect, they'd put him up against Alexander, who's also the prospect.
Right.
So it's like. Interesting that they're doing that, but it's going to be an interesting fight. If Gegard can pull off the win, that's huge for his career.
Huge. Well, Steven, it's always a pleasure, and you know, I'll keep reading your stuff. You're fair. You're good, is the thing.
Shucks. Shucks. Thank you, I appreciate it, and we'll do this again soon.
All right, Steven, take it easy.
All right.